Welcome to the Northern Leaders podcast. Today, we've got a very, very special guest who we're going to speak to shortly, Nazir Afzal OBE. Now, he's probably best known, he was the Chief Crown Prosecutor in the Northwest, appointed in 2011. He dealt with some huge cases. He dealt with the Dale Cregan case. He dealt with the Rochdale grooming sex abuse scandal as well. He's always used his voice for good. He's never been afraid to speak out. He's been threatened. He's had to have a police guard. He's now the Chancellor of the University of Manchester, but he continues to use his profile in the right way. And I'd like, if I may, to read a quote that I read on his LinkedIn account. And I'm just going to read it, if I may. He said, when he was defining leadership, he said, leadership comes at a cost, but it's nothing compared to those who have suffered harm and then have not been believed. Our legacy is what we do for strangers, not just for our family and friends. So I'm so thrilled that he's agreed to come in today, and we're going to be hearing from him straight after a word about our sponsors. This episode of Northern Leaders is sponsored by Wildbrook Commercial Real Estate. Wildbrook is an independent commercial property investment advisory business acting for investors on the purchase and sale of commercial properties. Well, welcome back. It's a big Northern Leaders welcome to Nazir Afzal, OBE, Chancellor at the University of Manchester.
Hello, Chris. Lovely to be here.
No, it's great to have you. Great to have you. Look, we start this podcast with two questions we ask all our guests. The first one is, you were born in Birmingham.
Yep.
But what does the North mean to you?
The way I describe it is I spent the first 20-odd years in Birmingham, then the next 20-odd years in London. So I was born in Birmingham, nurtured professionally in London, but I was made in Manchester. And the last 14, 15 years, Manchester's home. Didn't, strangely may sound, nowhere else was seemingly. So I feel very much in control. I feel my neighbours know me. I know my neighbours. I know the community. People talk to me, sometimes too much, but they do talk to me. And I feel very much as if this is where I want to spend the rest of my life.
Good. And hopefully you've got many more years of that life to be spending here in the North. You've held a number of senior leadership roles. You're perfectly placed to answer this question, but how do you define leadership?
I was just telling my son this morning. He said, "What do you want to do with your life, Dad?" I said, "What do you?" And I said to him, "My job is to increase the good and decrease the bad." And that, to my mind, is leadership. It's about liberating people so they can achieve their potential. It's about leading by example. It's about achieving results. It's about developing others. When I left prosecuting, 6 of the 13 chief prosecutors were people I've mentored. So they were people that I spotted and helped them progress. So I want to develop other people. I want to enthuse, encourage, and finally, build relationships. Leadership is about building relationships. We call it networks these days, don't we? But ultimately, it's about ensuring that you know people in lots of places so you can get through the obstacles that are currently put in your way. One
of the things that struck me when I was doing my research and having met you before is that you're a phenomenal communicator, and you seem to cut through. And there's no ridiculously long words. You are just a really clear communicator. Would you say that's your biggest
very much
strength?
so. I mean, I despair. I'm a trained lawyer, and I spent 35 years or so as a lawyer, although I'm not practicing anymore. And I always despair at lawyers using ipso facto and all sorts of language and airy-fairiness around that, when actually the people you're talking to need to understand it in words that they will understand. And so I've made it literally a mission on my part to make sure that I try and avoid language that would somehow suggest that I'm better than them or I know something more than they do. The reality is we need to talk to people in the language they will understand. And that's the reason why I get called to do lots of media, particularly around justice and those kinds of issues, is a hope that I'm able to explain things to the wider public in a way, quite frankly, that they might understand.
And that's where I think some leaders fall down, because they haven't got that clarity of message. You, like myself, are an adopted Northerner. You mentioned you're born in Birmingham, the 4th of 7 children to parents who emigrated from Pakistan. Home was a 2 up, 2 down.
Yeah.
What were you like as a child? Paint the picture.
You can imagine what a busy household that was. It was a loving household. My father was working 24/7. My mother was looking after us 24/7. I had 3 older siblings and 3 younger siblings, and it was just chaos, but organized chaos. We were absolutely enjoying the fact that we were able to progress and do what we wanted to do. Obviously, we didn't have we're working class family. I mean, my father was working in a factory, and I can't imagine how it would have been for him to be able to support us all, but he did, and it's felt safe in the house. It didn't feel that safe outside. Because we were different, and we were in a part of Birmingham, which, strangely, it's Small Heath. Everybody knows that now because of Peaky Blinders. But back then, nobody knew Small Heath. But it's also the shadow of Birmingham City Football Ground, Chris. And football is not the sport that it was back then, where people were hooligans and literally using football as an excuse to beat each other up. And so I didn't feel so safe sometimes on the streets. But I felt very safe at home.
There's a lot of things I want to talk to you about, but one recurring theme throughout your career that you've either experienced firsthand or you've spoken about has been racism.
Yeah.
So when you were 13, there was one incident that really stood out for me. You were walking home from school, you were set upon by racist thugs. Yeah. They fell to the floor, they kicked your head like a football to continue that footballing link. You're black and blue. You only saved because the taxi driver stopped and they
ran off.
They ran off. Yeah. You get home, you open the door, and then your dad sees you and he says, "Don't tell your mum."
Yeah, the first thing he said to me, "Don't tell your mum." And it was like and it was a message, not just to me actually, because it was something I was living anyway, that we never talked about any abuse we were getting at home. I didn't want to. My parents had suffered. Think about it. They came from Pakistan. They'd been through partition, where millions of people had died. They had seen it. My parents had seen the worst of humanity already. So I felt that because we were here and we were going to make the most of the opportunities that we had in this country, that I would not share all the negativity with them. I didn't talk to them. That story is one. Another story was when my father bought me a brand new uniform jacket, and it was in June rather than September, because I suppose it was cheaper then. I don't know. And I remember going into school, coming up to the end of school, and these boys just literally pulled the sleeve off my jacket, my blazer, and I went home, and obviously I couldn't tell them, and so I went upstairs and sewed it back on. And I then spent the whole year hoping that nobody would notice, because I didn't want them to know. I didn't want them to know that we were suffering, because they'd suffered enough to get us here.
I think what makes people what they are is a combination of their lifetime experiences. And there's so many experiences in your lifetime that brings you to where you are right now. Yeah. So your dad worked for the British Army. Yeah. And I think I'm right in saying that your uncle, or one of your uncles, was killed by the IRA during the Troubles.
Yeah, it was my father, if anybody's old enough to remember It Ain't Half Up, Mum. There was a BBC series about the Second World War, and it was during the 40s and 50s and 60s. The British, wherever the British Army were, there would be caterers, and my father was one of the caterers, and his father was too. And so when the trouble started in Northern Ireland in the late 60s, my father saw an opportunity. Let's go and provide catering services to the British Army in Northern Ireland. So he went out there with a group of some of my elder siblings and also other members of our family, and they were providing catering to the British Army. And in 1974, one of my uncles was with a younger member of my family, was grabbed by what we know to be the IRA in the back of a van, and in front of my younger member of my family, he was shot in the face. And then he was shot in my face, and the younger member was told, "Go and tell the boss to get out of Northern Ireland," i.e. my father. And my father stayed another 10 years.
And do you get some of that bravery, stubbornness, doing the right thing from your father?
100%. And from my mother. I mean, she, as I said, never mind the children that she had to bring up. She was also not the matriarch. She was somebody that was around the community, knocking on people's doors, making sure other members of the community were safe and secure and happy and contented. And so she was a force of nature. The two of them together made me what I am, 100%. And I take my resilience from them. I take my courage. I take my need to do the right thing from them.
You mentioned your upbringing in Birmingham, and you said there weren't many people from an ethnic background in Birmingham when you were growing up, I would imagine it would have been a lot less in Northern Ireland.
Oh, yeah.
So the racism probably would have been, I'm imagining, even more pronounced.
I think the British Army was different, though, because their relationship was with the British Army. They stayed on camp in Belfast or other parts of Northern Ireland, and the British Army had been travelling the world anyway. So, but again, these were different times. We had Benny Hill and you name it. So the stuff on television, I Love Thy Neighbour.
Yeah.
The stuff on television was openly racist anyway, and these were different times, and they accepted it, they tolerated it. They just did their job. At the end of the day, all they were concerned about was making sure their family was secure, and that's what they did.
I remember all them programs, and if you watch them now, you can't believe they came out.
You whinge. Honestly, I'm wincing when I'm listening to the language that's being used in those programs, and we call it brownface or blackface now, don't we? And Spike Milligan, great comedian that he was, was dressed up as an Indian, and you name it. It was, but it was of its time, and more bizarrely, I think, Chris. My father and I would be sat there watching and laughing.
Yeah, I know. And people don't understand that, but it's very difficult to judge that time now, retrospectively. I'm going to take you back to a time in your life when you were 8 or 10 and your parents decided they were going to take you and the family to Pakistan, which meant a several-week journey in the back of a transit van. Just tell us about that.
Yeah, absolutely. We'd never been. Obviously, I was born in this country, and my 3 younger siblings were born in this country. And my father and mother decided it's a great opportunity for us now to spend some time in northern Pakistan for them to understand where they came from. And so we went on a transit van. It was the best part of 3 weeks across, back then, of course, Yugoslavia, Iran, Afghanistan were all open. So we got to northern Pakistan. My 8-year-old cousin I was 8, and my 8-year-old cousin, so my father's brother's daughter, but from a mixed race family, Yasmin, was with us as well, and we had a great time. We spent 4 or 5 months in Pakistan, and then we had the 3-week journey back. And as we were traveling through Europe, my 8-year-old cousin Yasmin got sick, and my father and mother was determined we have to get home. You can imagine what the van was like and how we'd been traveling for as long as we had, and so they were determined to get us back. And they didn't understand how unwell she was. And as we entered Belgium, she died. And so we got we were going to have to get the ferry from Ostend back to Dover, and my mother put her in my arms and said, she's sleeping, look after her. And so for the 4-hour ferry ride across the channel, she's in my arms. And then when we got to Dover, obviously they reported it to the authorities, and she was taken from me. And a realization that she died from dehydration, Chris, which quite frankly these days we can deal with a pill or 2, But back in there, we didn't have Google, and they didn't know how seriously ill she was. And I realized then that nobody else was going to die in my arms. Literally, I was not going to allow this to happen. Whatever I could do to prevent harm is what I was going to do. And, she shouldn't have died. She died, and we pay the penalty for that. But, we didn't know any better.
You're in your 60s now, but it's as if when you talk about it, you're there holding her.
I picture it. You can't not picture it. It was pretty much my first experience of death, even though at the time, initially, I didn't know that she died.
You chose a career in law. I think you were only about 16, which is surprising given some of your history and some of your experiences. Why did you choose law, and what was the reaction from your family?
I think, well, initially, it was because I didn't have any role models. If you think about it back then, Chris, the only lawyer I knew was Perry Mason on TV. And, we didn't know any lawyers. And I realized that actually I didn't want to do what everybody else wanted me to do. Back then, children of immigrants were told you had to be a doctor or a scientist or an engineer. And part of the thinking behind that was that at some point, we're going to have to leave this country, and therefore you need to have a skill that's useful back where you came from. I think that was the thinking behind them. And I wanted to do law because if I had any role models, and I did have role models, they were people who were lawyers who'd achieved something. So who were they? I remember having this conversation with my dad. He asked me, I said, Atticus Finch, I said, Mahatma Gandhi, and I said, Nelson Mandela. Yeah. And my dad goes, one's fictional, One was murdered and the third's currently in prison. I said, yep, those are my role models, Dad. And they were all lawyers, a fictional one as well, who changed things. They use law as a tool. Look, there are thousands of lawyers better than me, Chris, and all credit to them. But I realized early on that law is just a means by which you can change things for the better. And that's why I decided to go down that route and pursue the career that I did.
You mentioned you left Birmingham and went to London. I know in your early career as a junior prosecutor, you were like working in the evening as a DJ, surviving on 3 hours sleep.
Well, you could do that back then. I still only sleep 4 or 5 hours a night, even now. But, I was living in North London, in Camden, at a time when people were really quite bohemian. I got to know people who run clubs, particularly one in Camden, and I decided to take on a particular night, Wednesday night, where I'd promote it. And literally I would be finding all these other DJs. I'd be DJing at the beginning of the set. There'd be nobody in the room virtually, but there was just an opportunity for me to DJ. I was a prosecutor by day, DJ by night, and I loved it. I was doing jungle and house and garage and all that sort of stuff, which I didn't know. You wouldn't know what house and garage is, would you? Yeah. When it comes to music, it's not somewhere where you live; it's somewhere you park a car. But I loved the music I was playing. I lived 3 doors away from Soul to Soul. So I was immersed in that sort of culture, and it was just great to be able to do that. Real great time in London for me.
What would I see on your playlist right now?
Still 80s and 90s stuff. I mean, I do listen to more modern stuff. Obviously, my children are well into it. But, I think the 80s, I'll be honest with you, I think the 80s was the best decade for music. There's stuff that I listen to now, which young people are listening to now, which is 40 years old. And I'm thinking, it was great back then.
Absolutely. Listen, you're talking my language. 2001, months after 9/11, you become the youngest person and first Muslim to hold the role of Assistant Chief Crown Prosecutor. Yeah. Do you remember how you felt then? And once again, what was the reaction to your appointment?
Firstly, it's quite amazing. This is about when I've been surrounded by some good leaders, and one of them was a guy called David Calvert-Smith. He's not a guy; he's Sir David. He's Calvert-Smith now, and he was the Director of Public Prosecutions back in the late 90s, early 2000s. And for him to appoint me as a first chief prosecutor grade 3 months after 9/11. You can imagine how courageous it was of him. And I wasn't tested in the same way that some people were. What I'd done was I had actively sought the more difficult cases. That's why I had made my reputation back then. And I'd actively worked on the more horrible stuff, serial killers, pedophiles, you name it, that kind of stuff. And that, I think, is what set me up to be able to do that role. But what it was an opportunity. I saw it as an opportunity where, I could build really good teams that would focus on the day-to-day and enable me to focus on the things that we weren't so good at and reach out to the public. And that's what I chose to do.
Journalists have got a reputation, not always good. But I, as a journalist, have always felt stories have changed me. If I've covered a particularly harrowing court case or a tragedy, or I've done a door knock and spoken to a family who've lost somebody they loved, it changes me. And I always say to people, it should change you because we're human. It's when you try and pretend that you're not. Looking through your, I think, 24-year career in the Crown Prosecution Service, punctuated by really high-profile cases. And you did one in 2007 that really impacted you, which was Fiona Pilkington. Yeah. She killed herself and her severely disabled daughter because they were subjected to harassment, and the police didn't do enough about it. No. What do you remember about that, and how did that change you?
Well, it wasn't just that. I mean, that's one example of a case where what it taught me, quite frankly, is that we as authorities were interested in process. This is the process by which we deal with the case, and this is the appropriate charge, rather than thinking about the impact on the person. What Fiona's case, what dozens of other cases have been able to do is show me how important the impact is. And if we look at whatever we're dealing with through the lens of impact, this means a lot to you. For example, stalking, what they were experiencing, what Fiona and her child was experiencing, was that they were prisoners in their own home. And what the police were doing was saying, it's just some eggs, being thrown at you. Not realizing the phenomenal impact it was having on them. And that, I think, is where I learned very early on. Start by looking at things through impact, and start by listening to victims. Listening I didn't touch on that earlier when I talked about leadership. It's the skill, quite frankly, that we so undervalue. I'm an advocate. I can talk for England, but listening is the skill that we do not value enough, because the experts in antisocial behavior, the experts in stalking, the experts in violence against women are the women who are and the people who are most impacted by these crimes. They will tell you what went wrong. They will tell you what needs to be done to fix it. And as leaders, we need to be listening to them and then acting upon what we've heard.
I always say, as an editor to my staff, put yourselves in the position of the reader. And how does that story impact on you? So if it's full of mistakes, if it's a positive story, if it's a negative story, how does it impact on them? And then once you get into their shoes, you're halfway there. And I think from a Crown prosecution point of view, where it falls wrong from the police and the CPS perspective is when people are treated like a number.
It's still the case, and I've never been shy about saying it, but the mantra has been for about 20 years: victims at the centre of the criminal justice system, and there's a word for that. It's rubbish. That does not exist right now, Chris. If you were a witness in a case at 5:00 tonight, you're going to get a phone call saying you are due at X Crown Court tomorrow morning, and you will say, "I'm busy, I've got family commitments or whatever it is, childcare," and they will say, "We don't care. You need to be at court 10:00 tomorrow morning." How is that putting the victim at the centre of the justice system? That's for the convenience of everybody else. Yeah. And so the justice system talks the talk, but it doesn't walk the walk. And you've got to recognise that human beings have their own commitments and responsibilities, and work around them, and not just the lawyers and other staff, for example.
You became the Chief Crown Prosecutor for the North West of England in 2011. Before we talk about your career, what was your first perception of the North West when you came up here?
Do you know, I thought I was coming for a break. I'd spent 20 years working in London, dealing with all the most horrific things you can possibly imagine. I thought, I've done all that. Now it's time for something more calming. It was 2011 was also the beginning of austerity. And so what had happened was that the CPS had to restructure. And so the Northwest region was created for me, in effect. Created, and I was the first chief. So the counties of the North, rather than having one chief prosecutor each, Merseyside, Greater Manchester, there was one for the North. So I thought, similar population to London, but I hadn't heard much about what was going on up here. I thought it was going to be a lot easier and less stressful than my experiences in London. Part of the reason why I'd not heard how things, crime happens everywhere, was, of course, the media is all centred on London. So they're not particularly interested in anything that happens outside of London. So, but I really thought I was coming here for, to see out the rest of my years in a more calmer, less stressful environment. How long I was.
100%. I mean, I've hosted probably 3,500 events, and there's some events are memorable for different reasons. And I remember hosting an event in 2012, and Tony Lloyd, the late MP, he was one of the speakers, and got a news alert. And it was to say that 2 police officers in Greater Manchester had been murdered, had been killed. Yeah. And I remember this wave went through the room of shock, of genuine shock and anger. And, for those not familiar with the story, it was Dale Cregan, who is famous for one eye. That was his caricature, really. That was how he was known. He was subsequently convicted of 4 murders, including the 2 police officers in question, PC Fiona Bone and PC Nicola Hughes as well. Now, I can remember that moment, and I'm feeling this anger, as I say, and this helplessness as well. You were the guy who authorised the prosecution of Dale Cregan for the 4 murders. How do you keep your emotions in check?
You got to be emotional. We're human, but at the same time, we got to be professional. I remember, obviously, once he'd murdered Nicola and Fiona, the media were strange. He already murdered 2 gangsters, but nobody seemed to care about those. Yeah. Strangely, but anyway, once he'd murdered Nicola and Fiona, the media were here all over the region, particularly around where police headquarters was. And I remember the Sunday afternoon when the evidence had been presented to me, and I decided to charge him with all 4. We had a press conference, and Peter Fahey, who was the chief constable at the time, and I were jointly doing this press conference, and the media were surprised, quite frankly. We were publicly talking about, we don't do this. And sadly, they've gone backwards because they don't do enough of it now. But the public were interested, and therefore you should be out there transparently telling the public what you were doing and why you're doing it. And that's why it was essential to do that. Because it was also about reassurance. People were scared. People don't realize, even if the murderer was in custody and facing trial, people were scared that anybody could be harmed, and I had to provide reassurance too. It's not just about telling them facts, but strange as it may sound, Chris, I published my memoir a couple of years ago, 3 years ago, and my wife's reading through all this. She goes, "I didn't know you did all this. My home was my safe environment. I never ever talked about my work at home," and so there had to be a line drawn between the professional and the emotional, and I somehow drew it.
No, absolutely. He was subsequently jailed for life. Back in, he's been in prison now ever since.
Yeah.
We're going to have a quick break.
He'll die in prison. He's been given a whole life order.
That's right. We're going to have a short break, and when we come back, I'm going to ask you about another case that really changed the direction of your life. So welcome back to the Northern Leaders podcast. Now, delighted to be joined by Nazir Afzal. We've spoken about some of the big cases in your career, and it's like a boxer. Every fight's a big fight. Every case is a big case. And I think you've always viewed every case as separate, and it's certainly big to the victims. One of the biggest decisions you ever made was when you were the Chief Crown Prosecutor, was to overturn a decision that had been made by the Crown Prosecution Service to authorise prosecutions in the case of the Rochdale child sex abuse gang. At the time, these are quotes, you suggested that white professionals' oversensitivity to political correctness and fear of appearing racist may well have contributed to justice being stalled. Just tell us about that period of your life.
I moved up to Manchester in May 2011, and if you remember, the Times newspaper, a brilliant journalist, Andrew Norfolk, had been writing some stories about these type of sexual abuse networks around the country, and nobody really be paying any attention, despite what people say now that they were the first people. They weren't, and I asked my teams if we had something of that nature on our in our book, so to speak, and they brought to me the so-called Rochdale grooming gang case, which had, if you remember, if people have seen the BBC film Three Girls, this was based on that case, and the actor who played me was much more handsome than I am. So I'll take that. Yeah. But, if the girl walks into a takeaway restaurant in 2008, she starts smashing it up. Police officers attend, she's arrested. She then discloses that she'd been raped by the two men in that venue. The police then carry out a really poor investigation where actually they just investigated her and her credibility. She had low-level criminality. She was from a very troubled background. They investigated her. They didn't really bother investigating the perpetrators. But that was the case with all sexual abuse, unfortunately, is that they were more concerned about whether the victim was credible. Anyway, at the end of that 9-10 months of an investigation, the officers formed a view that she wasn't credible, that there was no point prosecuting those men. They went to two prosecutors, both of whom were white, and both of them, hearing what the officer had to say about her credibility, came to the same view that there's no point bothering prosecuting. So that was in 2009. I moved up here in 2011, and I, having now asked for this, have we got similar cases? They brought this to me, and by that time, this is what happens when you don't deal with, hold people to account, is that others feel they can act with impunity. So by the time 2011 had happened, Chris, there were now 9 men and up to 47 girl victims. Right? Because the police has not acted for those 2 years. And the problem we had, or they had, was they said to me, how do we, I said, I believe every single word she's saying. And all the others are saying, I want to prosecute this case. And they said, Nazir, the problem we have is that we've told the world that we did not believe her, by not prosecuting initially. And I said, well, this is what we do. We admit that we got it wrong. And there was silence in the room because institutions don't admit. And I said, the only way we can get this before a jury is say, members of the jury, we want you to believe her. We didn't believe her initially. We got that wrong. That's the only way we're going to get this case started. Anyway, as chief, I was able to get that through, and we did. And those men were ultimately prosecuted. There was a 4-month trial in Liverpool Crown Court, and they were ultimately convicted in May 2012. And it really was quite an extraordinary month, May 2012, for a number of reasons. One of which was it seemed like the world woke up to sexual abuse of children, as if they, didn't know it was happening in this country, when in fact the exact opposite is true. People were also just focusing on street grooming of the type that we'd seen then in Rochdale, and nobody else wanted to put their head above the parapet, Chris. So it ended up with me doing articles and media and all that to explain to people the ethnicity of the perpetrators was an issue. But the issue was that these girls, and thousands of girls like that, had just not been listened to for all manner of reasons, including political correctness, but mainly incompetence, to put it bluntly. And I was explaining that 2/3 of all sexual abuse of children happens in the family. People who they know. The next largest group of victims are online. Right now, for pennies, you can watch a child being sexually abused for you. The third largest group are institutional sexual abuse victims, so victims in places of worship, schools, colleges, And street grooming, whilst it's a massive issue, thousands of victims, it's actually the smallest number of victims compared to all the others. But we had not paid any such attention to this issue. We'd been saying to children for decades, hadn't we? You should be seen and not be heard. What a surprise now that we were hearing them and what they had to say. So I was trying to get that. I got phone calls from Prime Minister Cameron and you name it. My name was being mentioned in the House of Parliament, all this stuff, just to get people to understand that we had finally addressed this issue and we were now going to move with vigor and robustness in tackling these crimes. And then something even more strange happened, Chris. I wasn't ready for this bit, was that the far right, which was at that time was the British National Party, realised that I damaged their narrative, because their narrative was straightforward. All brown men are the rapists. When it became public knowledge that the only reason these brown men were before the court was because of a brown man, they didn't like that. And so they put out some fake news on their websites saying that I had been the one in 2008-9 that hadn't prosecuted these guys, given that I'd never lived here until 2011. Anyway, nonetheless, unfortunately, their followers believed that. And so despite the fact that you've heard all the cases I've dealt with, some of them, I've dealt with serial criminals, organised crime, none of them came to my house. Suddenly, Chris, I had far-right thugs trying to break into my house. I had to have panic alarms placed in every room. I had to teach my kids, my youngest was 9 at the time, how to use a panic alarm. My kids could only go to school in a taxi for 4 months because that was the security advice I was given. For 2 weeks, I had a police officer stationed outside of my front door. I had to tell my kids the Prime Minister's got a police officer outside his door. The only way I could provide reassurance. And yet I was getting all of this despite being the one person that got everything right.
But this was the interesting thing, though, because like the far right targeted you, the English Defence League.
Yeah.
Nick Griffin doorstepped
He doorstepped me, yeah.
He doorstepped you. Yeah. You accused you're a practicing Muslim, and you spoke about a deficit in leadership in some parts of the Muslim community in not challenging certain behaviours.
Yep.
So parts of the Muslim community criticised you as well. And what I thought was really amazing is, despite in effect being kicked from both sides, you said that the far right campaigners wanted us to deport you, and your answer was, "I was born in Birmingham. They can deport me to Birmingham if they want to." So you sort of diffused that bomb. Yeah. With humour.
Well, publicly, I had to. You can't. Going back to your earlier point about professionalism and emotion, you can't. I couldn't talk publicly and show people that actually I was. Not only was I scared, more importantly, I was worried for my family. My wife was suffering. My children, there was the early days of social media, and they were reading stuff online and thinking, why are they saying this about our dad? And so they were, the fact that they couldn't go to sports clubs and stuff like that because of security advice. So. To my mind, I was more worried about the impact on them, but I couldn't show this publicly. And the other thing that people may not know, Chris, is that there are a number of reasons why I survived that period. I came very close to quitting because of what was happening to my family. The first reason I didn't survive was my colleagues. the people who worked with me in the Crown Prosecution Service, because they rallied around. I still remember my PA running down the corridor with a letter that contained feces saying, don't tell him. They kept the worst excesses from me. I remember another reason was my boss. My boss told my staff, I didn't know this at the time, he told my staff, Nazir must not have any meetings between 9 and 10 a.m. and 3 and 4 p.m. because he needs to be available to do the school run. Nazir will not be invited to any overnight conferences or meetings in London that require him to have an overnight stay because he needs to be at home to be able to protect his family. I didn't know why I was not being invited to meetings for several weeks. But because we leaders, going back to your leadership point, don't ask for help. I would not have asked for that help. He realized that I needed that help. You know this guy, his name's Keir Starmer. Yeah. So he actually made sure that I was safe and secure and contented, even when I did not want to know that's what I needed.
That is leadership.
That's 100% that's leadership. Looking out for the people that you are with and making sure that even when they don't ask for it, you have your ears to the ground, you're listening, you know what needs to be done, and you do it in the end. And the third group of people that made me get through that phase were victims, because finally they were being heard. Finally, they told me this. And Nazir, there are many more of us. Please carry on doing this job because we need more of us to be heard. And so what Keir did was put me in charge of the national response. A national panel was set up. We were inviting up and down the country police officers and prosecutors to share with us those cases that they were concerned about that we might have got wrong. We were putting them right. And we went very quickly, Chris, from being pretty poor at tackling sexual abuse of children to by 2015 we had the highest conviction rate for child sexual abuse in British history.
Yeah, and well done you, and
well done to everybody.
Well done everybody else as well. I mentioned earlier about my association with Rochdale, and I'm really passionate about the area as well. I know, and I mentioned the fact that for the media, Rochdale is an easy target.
Yeah,
and for them that know Rochdale, like I do, I see these amazing people of all backgrounds.
Yes.
Now. And they're an easy target for the media. You spent a number of years at Hopwood Hall College.
Yeah, I was chair of Hopwood Hall. I agree with you entirely. I mean, I've every experience I've had, even during these trials and the aftermath, the bulk of Rochdalians, if that's the right phrase, were immensely supportive and understood what they needed to do and acted accordingly. And the Rochdale is the world's home of the cooperative movement.
Yeah.
It has so much going for it. And you've just talked about the businesses that are flourishing. But as Hopwood Hall is the FE college for Rochdale, and it's growing from strength to strength. It's outstanding in so many areas. And I was delighted to be chair. And I didn't take that on because I wanted to give something back to Rochdale. I wanted to give something back to children. That's why I took it on. But it seemed almost too good to be true, really, that I'm playing my part in trying to rehabilitate Rochdale's reputation, if that's the right phrase. But it's the saddest thing. Just 3 weeks ago, Swedish television came up to Rochdale to do a program about Rochdale. And so I'm walking around with them as we're going around Rochdale. And all they wanted to talk about was the grooming gangs. And I tried to change the narrative and talk about all the good stuff, but that's all they're concerned about. And this is a product, really. It doesn't matter. But we've got to get the facts out there. We've got to keep getting the narrative, try and change the narrative.
The only way to counteract bad news is by putting good news out there.
100%.
You always were very quick to point out that the vast majority of paedophiles in Britain were white. That is a fact.
Yeah.
In May 2013, you were responsible for the prosecution of former BBC presenter Stuart Hall, who was convicted of multiple sex offences against girls and young women. What were your memories of that?
I mean, Stuart Hall was somebody I grew up with again. We watched It's a Knockout, and he was a Radio 5 sports DJ and everything. Suddenly, because of Rochdale, let's be clear about it, because we'd finally got things right, or begun to get things right around the voices of children. hundreds and thousands of women, in particularly women and girls, were coming forward and talking about the abuse they'd suffered, and they were prepared to stand up to power. And so 12 women accused Stuart Hall of sexual abuse going back 3 decades. And he ultimately was convicted. And some people may remember, at one of the earlier hearings, he was outside of Preston Magistrates Court saying, he will be vindicated and all of this is lies, etc., etc., and ultimately pleaded guilty to the abuse of 11 women. And he was found not guilty of the abuse of 1 woman. And I remember going to see that woman in the aftermath of the trial and saying to her, I'm really sorry that I couldn't give you closure. And she looked me in the eye and said, Nazir, you gave me closure the moment you believed me. And that was a real moment for me, Chris, because I realized, like everybody else, I was fixated on process: arrest, charge, conviction, sentence. Actually, what most victims want is just to be heard. And the fact that eventually, it doesn't matter how powerful, I dealt with enough powerful people in my time to know that they're not above the law. And the only reason why the law matters is because it should be that nobody's above the law.
What's really telling, though, if you don't mind me saying, is that 12 victims came forward. He was convicted in relation to 11 of them. You went back to the 12th, the one whose complaint wasn't upheld, because it's too easy to focus on what you get right. And she is a victim still. She
of course she is. And as an addendum, I suppose, a couple of years ago, I have a website that I haven't updated for a long time, Chris, but it has a contact page. And every day, even this morning, I got an email from somebody saying, X-rate me, should I report to police? My answer all the time is yes. But anyway, I got this email a couple of years ago from a woman, and it said this: Dear Mr. Afzal, you will remember me. I was one of the victims at Stuart Hall. I now have terminal cancer. I only have a few weeks to live, but I wanted you to know that my life began when you believed me.
Yeah.
And I sat and looked at this email for a couple of days, and I thought, what do I do? Thank you? No, that's not what I need to have. So I sent her my phone number, and we spoke. And she explained to me that for 30 odd years since the abuse had happened, she'd been blamed for everything. Her family didn't believe her. Her friends didn't believe her. If they did believe her, they said it was her. She caused it in some way, shape or form. And her whole life had been a complete and utter trauma. And then suddenly she was heard. Suddenly she was believed. Suddenly he got justice. And she, in for the last 10 years of her life, she was able to have a life that was worth living. And here she was at the end of her life, wanting to tell me that I'd changed her life for the better. And I went to her funeral a few weeks later, because I don't make a habit of going to funerals of people whom I've never met, or who I met in passing. And I was at this funeral wondering, why am I here? And I realized why I was there. I was there because she had told me that I had changed her life for the better. I wanted her to know that she had changed my life for the better.
Yeah, and I think that's just wonderful, genuinely wonderful, because ultimately when we talk about legacy is all about whether or not we've changed people's lives for the better.
And not just family and friends. We often think that legacy is about making your family and friends' lives better. Our legacy should be what we do for strangers.
I feel like I read the same blueprint that you say. When you walk down the street, if you help that person who drops a fiver by racing after him and give it to him back, you have helped that person. You don't know if that fiver was all they've got to feed their kids. We'll never know. But if you put it in your pocket and just forget about it, you don't know that person. When I talked about trust deficit and decency deficits, we have a decency deficit. We're not kind to each other anymore as much as we used to be. We revel, because of social media, we revel in people's misfortune. We just come down on them in some ways, attack them for everything and anything, for simple mistakes sometimes. And we used to be kind, and we need to be kinder. Well, I remember after Rochdale, I had a town hall event where there was like 500 people in the room, and I said to them, why did nobody else notice what was going on? And somebody shouted out, do you want us all to be grasses? Do you want us to be whistleblowers? And I said, no, I want us to be what we were, a nation of good neighbors, looking out for each other, looking after our own children and somebody else's children. And that, I think, is what we've lost a lot of. We haven't lost all of it, I can assure you, because some of the great stuff that we're doing now and the people I'm meeting now are doing phenomenal work in ensuring the sense of community that we've got as a North in a way that perhaps other parts of the country don't have. You left the Crown Prosecution Service 10 years ago in 2015, and you've used your voice to speak out on a range of issues, including violence against women, honour killings, something you've been very passionate about, and you've always spoken out on behalf of the victim. You became an outspoken critic of the government's cuts to the Crown Prosecution Service and the Ministry of Justice. You pointed out that when the rape conviction levels dropped, you pointed back to these cutbacks and said, cause and effect.
What do you expect?
Yeah, you're not a man who can sit on the sidelines and say nothing.
Thank God for that. Actually, I get bored very easily as well, so I have to keep going on and on about things that, quite frankly, somebody said to me the other day. I'm now chair of the Lowry Theatre in Salford, and somebody said the working class people just don't get a look in when it comes to creative industries. And I said, right, I'm going to conduct some research in this area. So I've created an organisation called Class Ceiling, which is about trying to identify barriers for working class people in the arts. When I was chair of the Catholic Church's Safeguarding Agency, because Catholic Church was saying to me, we need to be satisfied and assured that we're looking after people who are engaging with the church. And I said, well, I'll chair that. And so we put in place a regulator that didn't exist before, and hopefully transforming that. I'm now the chair of the Church of England's Safeguarding Agency, which I took on in October of last year. And then a month later, the Archbishop of Canterbury resigned. No connection. Yeah. But I've been working hard in any environment. I would get bored if it was easy. If it's tough, tell me about it and see if I can do something about it.
If it's easy, everyone will do it. You resigned as Chief Executive of the Association of Police and Crime Commissioners after the Manchester Arena bombing in May 2017, somewhere else where you'll remember, something else we all remember where we were when we found out, because you wanted to express your views on BBC's Question Time. You felt the need for the public to be reassured outweighed your job.
100%. I remember having the terrible crime happened on the evening of the 22nd of May. And then the next day, I went into, my offices were in Westminster, I went into the board of police and crime commissioners, all of whom, as you know, are politicians. And I said to them, people are knocking on my door. And I mean, Chris, they were knocking on my door in Manchester saying, Nazir needs to say something, Nazir needs to say something. And I told my board, I need to say something and I need to talk about it publicly. And they said, no, you can't. I said, well, fine, here's my resignation. And I walked out. Literally, I remember walking, because it was near Westminster Abbey, my office. I remember walking out of that office, having just drafted a letter at that minute and handed it in, and getting on the train back up to Manchester. And then straight away, I was doing interviews, not just at Question Time, but I was doing interviews to reassure people, but also to put some perspective around this criminal, this terrible criminal, had done this terrible crime to the people of Manchester, to children. He'd focused, often missed, is the attack was deliberately aimed at a group of women and girls. Ariana Grande has a predominantly women and girls audience, and that's what we were dealing with. And bizarre as it may sound, last night before we having this conversation, I was with the family of Safi Rose, who was 8 years old and murdered at the arena, and it's extraordinary how. We talk about how courageous we may be in some things we do. Think about what Andrew and Lisa have been through, losing their child. Lisa was told she had 15% chance, the mother, of surviving, and Wythenshawe Hospital, by the way, let me say it on the record. Again, people may not know this. They were absolutely fantastic in the aftermath from the arena. The NHS throughout Greater Manchester and beyond was absolutely fantastic, because there would have been, we know there were 22 murdered people. There would have been dozens more had it not been for the phenomenal people that work in the NHS in Greater Manchester, and particularly at Wythenshawe. And, to my mind, quitting a job and not having money coming in next month is the smallest price to pay. And I'm glad I did, because, I was then able to focus on other things that I wanted to do, where I think I could make a difference. Maybe I couldn't make a difference there anymore.
It gets back to the point you made at the start, though. When you decided to prosecute Dale Cregan for the 4 murders, you said we need to get out there and we need to give the public reassurance.
Public confidence doesn't come from press releases. Too many organisations will issue a press release and that's it. You need to be put out there. In recent weeks, I've done documentaries on, I can't even talk about them, but they're high-profile documentaries. You'll see them later in the summer, about things that, quite frankly, people may not want to talk about. And I'm happy to put my face to these things. I'm happy to try and share my insight in these things. But you've got to be out there. The public are paying through their taxes or through subscriptions or whatever it is for all these services. And therefore we as public servants, or not even if we're public, just simply being citizens of the United Kingdom, needs to make sure that we're out there explaining to people why things are happening, listening to what they have to say about it and acting upon it. I just don't understand why people don't do that.
Leadership. It's leadership again. That's the definition of leadership. I don't just want to talk to you about race. I find myself talking about it because it's been such a recurring theme in your career and your life. You're very, very vocal on the impact of social media after the Southport attacks. Do you worry about the world that we live in, especially when we look what's happening across the Atlantic with Donald Trump and Elon Musk? Yeah,
of course. One kind of, I'm Chancellor University, and the opportunities are great because there's loads of Americans coming over, by the way. You didn't know this. Yeah. They're flying over now for the next 4 years, want to live here, work here, contribute to British society. And that's that. So there's a positive. However, I am worried. Of course I'm worried. I mean, the riots we had in August of 2024 were the first social media riots. I dealt with the August 11 ones, and we didn't have much social media then. In 24, people were filming what they were doing, stupidly filming what they were doing, because that was the evidence that ultimately convicted them. But then they were inciting other people to do the same thing, and it was really troubling. And there seems to be no mute button on social media. People feel empowered. Keyboard warriors think they can say and do what they want, and they can attack people whenever they want. And it's creating division, it's creating hostility, it's creating tension. And those are the kinds of things that we should be worried about, absolutely. But I'm also an optimist. I talk to my children quite frequently, and they're all in their 20s. And I tell you something, they know what's going on, and they are going to work to try and fix these problems that we and our generation have created for them.
That's good to hear. No, that is good to hear. But I mean, you can't be what you can't see. 2 questions to finish off with. The first one is, you've now got 6 honorary doctorates. And I was looking at your LinkedIn account, and you say you don't deserve any of them. Now, you were, which I'm sure you're being modest, you were awarded an OBE by the Queen. You met the late Pope Francis. You've met Boris Johnson, so it's not all good, clearly. Are there any Northern leaders that you particularly admire? Yeah, we've got tons of them. I mean, obviously, I'm great respect for the mayors of the mayors, Steve Rotherham, Andy Burnham. You name it. These are phenomenal mayors. Even people like Ben Houchen and Kim McGuinness in the north, and the mayors put themselves out there, and Tracy Brabin in West Yorkshire. They're doing great work to try and make things happen. The people that matter to me, the people I value the most, are the people who get things done. The biggest group of people are the unsung heroes, Chris. I'm patron of nine charities, 9 NGOs, all run by women. So Yasmin in Middlesbrough, you name it. Edna, these are people who are phenomenal. They're working pretty much for minimum wage. They're giving 24 hours of their lives, 7 days a week, for protecting the most vulnerable people. They are the ones who inspire me and motivate me to keep going. And we are just doing what we can. If I can give them access to something or find them a door that open a door for them, I will do that. But we are very fortunate, I think, in the north of England, because you literally have to turn a corner, you'll find a leader you can admire. No, perfectly summed up again. Final question. Many years from now, if there was an epitaph for you, what would you want it to be? How would you want to be remembered?
I think the tagline from my first book was amplifying the voices of the unheard. And I hope that's what I continue to do and always have done. We used to the language, people don't have a voice. That's not true. Everybody has a voice. We as authorities, institutions, leaders haven't been hearing them. And so I hope my epitaph is that I've just listened, and I continue to listen. And then when I've heard something that needs to change, I try and change it.
Nazir Afzal, thanks very much for joining us on the Northern Leaders podcast. You can see why, and hopefully the listeners can understand why you were using Your Voice for Good award winner in January this year, and why I'm very, very proud that you're part of the Northern Leaders. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Chris.
Business Cloud provides tech insight with Byte. To get the best business tech news straight into your inbox, just subscribe to our free newsletter. Details on our website. Well, what can I say about that? Everything I hope for from that interview with Nazir Afzal. I feel extremely honoured to be in the position that I am, to be in the company of greatness, really. People who their guiding North Star has been doing the right thing. And throughout his career, he's made decisions that haven't always made him popular, but he's made the right decision. He's been fearless. He's been attacked. He's been threatened, but he's always come back to making what he thinks is the right decision. And he's never lost sight of the fact that it comes down to the victims and believing the victims and just getting to the truth as well. And I was trying to think of a quote that best summed it up, actually, and I've written it down. It's from a guy called John C. Maxwell, and he wrote, "A leader is one who knows the way, goes the way, and shows the way." And if you were to sum up the life of Nazir Afzal, that would be it. He knows the way, but he goes beyond that. He goes the way, and more importantly, he shows the way. And that's why he is such a fantastic Northern leader for me.